Welcome to Breaking the Silence of Design, a bi-monthly vodcast designed to discuss the issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the built environment. My name is Karen Compton, principal of A3K Consulting, and your co-host.
And I'm Gabrielle Bullock, principal and director of global diversity for Perkins & Will, and your other co-host. And this discussion is actually a year in the making.
Yeah.
We sat down a year ago with our next guest, who courageously came and discussed his anger and his desire for action following the murder of George Floyd. So we're going to watch a little bit of that episode.
Okay.
You know, there's no lack of knowledge now. You can't claim ignorance, not in this world. I mean, we can see it. I mean, it's on camera, right? It's no longer, well, see, he said, she said, this person. We can see it. We all watched George Floyd murdered. We watched it. And if that didn't stir something in you, because you've numbed yourself because of society, I get it. You know, there's a lot of bad news out there. But for me, as I said, you know, the only way for me to get through being angry is to move to action.
Wow, it's hard to believe that was a year ago, David.
It's hard to believe you're having me back.
We're happy to have you.
I'm very happy to be here.
Welcome, David Hart, president of Steinberg Hart.
They've kept me in that role, so I'm
so clearly you're doing something right.
No recall yet.
No, we'll see what happens, right? So much has changed in the last year, and I actually sat and looked at a calendar, and it was literally a year ago this week that we sat down and had this conversation. Wow. Hard to believe. And we talked about, at that time, your very raw anger and your move from anger to action. And so as we kind of sit here now, a year later, and think about that, you know, what has changed for you personally in that year? And then what's been the biggest transformation in your practice?
If I can, I'd like to just answer those in reverse order.
Yeah.
Because I will say the change in the practice, the initiative of our JEDI group has been really a shining light. It's about 20% of the people in the firm, so the old 80-20 rule kind of
still applies.
Very much, right? And so it's about 30 people who are extremely committed, extremely diverse, age, gender, race, and across all the offices. What's interesting, and I think actually a silver lining to the pandemic, is that everybody was able to connect on you know, the same Zoom square, the same footing, and that I think was an interesting sort of democratic or had an equalizing effect. That group has continued to amaze me, and I'll tell you the key that I think is that I'm excited about and proud of is that instead of it having to be a group that is what I'll call a suggestion box group, they are a group that is empowered. The first steps were, David, how much money do we have to spend? And I said, don't worry about that part. What do you want to do? And it was open-ended. And really the limit of what that group could take on was their capacity to take it on. I'll tell you, when they broke into two groups. One was more about community outreach, and one that was more about internal culture. And those two groups meet every 2 weeks together as a group, but then they have their own separate meetings and separate initiatives. When they publish their paper of what they plan to do, I've come out of partner retreats and client workshops with, you know, we were going to go to the moon and back. I thought this is too much, you know, and so I was starting to encourage, well, let's do less and let's, you know, and I was wrong. I was wrong. The group enlisted people from outside the group who are passionate about certain areas, scholarships, teaching, ACE, and then looked at all of the different areas within the firm where we were already doing something, and then started to look at it through a JEDI lens. So instead of just being a group off to the side, cooking their own, ideas and their own things. How do we integrate this into the firm? So, sorry I went on a little long about that, but I think part of then what changed me is I realized that this was really, and I got some good coaching from a variety of different people, which was, David, you need to get out of the way, and you don't need to be the face of this, but you need to be supportive. And so Karen, you've known me a long time. Being supportive and giving people space is probably not how I got to where I am in my career. So I have
your strongest attribute.
I have really, over the last year, this has been a process of really figuring out how to empower people. I thought I knew how to do that, but I really have learned in the last year how to help people do what they're passionate about. And really now it's a matter of how do we keep that going? And that's really where we sit a year from now is now what does forever into the future look like?
What I appreciate about your response is the level of self-awareness, realizing that wasn't necessarily your strong suit, but that you needed to get out of the way. In order for this to really anchor and take wings and move forward, whatever metaphor we choose to use, you needed to support it and you needed to learn what that looked like, but then you needed to let people give them the space in which to do that. And I think that level of self-awareness is what a number of leaders need to try and understand in order to support their initiatives.
We get a lot of questions. What do we do first? How do we keep the momentum going? And so I appreciate, I'm sure our audience will appreciate how they broke it up and how they came back together and how can you tag along. And I'm glad that they stopped you from saying, whoa, too much. Because I think it's important that you just can't do one aspect. I mean, you don't have to do everything at once to the same degree, but so kudos to you.
Well, it's been a process of, that's why I wanted to answer the questions in reverse order, is that I really have to, and I haven't thanked that group, but I have to really thank the JEDI group and the firm for helping me find a different mode of leading. It hasn't been, it's not as easy as it may sound to step aside and be supportive.
It's a new way of leadership.
It's a new way of leadership.
Especially, for
Yeah. So I have a question for you. So privately, you've shared with us that you continue to unearth justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues both within the practice and within the industry in ways that you may not have seen before. From a practice standpoint, what was the most stunning or eye-opening issue that you had to address, and how did you do that?
I love the question. We said from and I am part of the JEDI group. I just
Are you quiet?
I don't come to all the meetings, and I'm kind of I'll call myself a quarterly.
Okay, you're a quarterly attendee.
But one of the aspects, what to me was, if we don't make this part of our design, integral part of our design process, then it's an add-on, right? Same way we needed to integrate sustainability into the core of our practice to make it matter. It couldn't be an add-on like it was. So, or QA/QC, you pick the element of an AEC practice. So we knew it had to be integral and central to design. And so the thing we targeted was our design reviews, and we started having really good, spirited conversations about what was wrong with our design reviews. And it was amazing how many, we talked about quieted voices. I'll call them marginalized voices. How many people who were talked over, traditionally by white men, who were talked over, or their ideas weren't given full credence. All of these things were happening in design review, so people would withdraw. And we talked about, you can't have true collaboration without diversity, and you can't have true diversity without collaboration. So these things are kind of intertwined. So the design reviews, to me, were I knew it was important, but I also was kind of shocked by the feedback of how people felt about the design reviews. This thing that brings me joy and excitement was something that other people saw with anxiety. They didn't want to do them. It was not a happy place to be or participate. And it's actually from some of the younger folks on the JEDI group who came up with an idea through the use of a Miro board. And Miro board is, I'm sure you've heard about this from a lot of architects who are using them. We do breakout groups so that the design team comes in and presents their design. And then a facilitator within the firm, another design director who's not involved with the project typically, or always, breaks into 3 or 4, depending on how many participants we have, small groups, so that there is room for discussion and drawing on the Miro board, discussing, and those end up being really lively, smaller group discussions. And then those come back to the larger group, and that's shared back to the larger group. And so instead of trying to review 3 designs in an hour, we review 1 in an hour, and we have a more
robust discussion,
inclusive process. So I think everybody has identified that as a success. I'm now taking that back to my clients and saying, look at what our group, and not from the standpoint of look at this diversity element, but really just about quality of design, quality of thinking. Your project was so important to us that we opened it up to our, not just one office, because now we're virtual, the whole firm. So we've got all kinds of interaction. So long story short, the thing that this venue has given us is it's given us our most experienced designers and our most junior designers in the same room, small room setting, comfortable setting like this, being able to talk about design ideas. And to me, I was shocked by the challenge, and I was even more blown away about how simple the solution was, and then I love where it came from.
David, in that scenario, have your designers, have your design teams now, do they approach design differently? Instead of getting the response at a critique, have they started the process differently?
I think there is a little bit of a difference. There's much more preparation about what do we want to focus on in this review. So the teeing up of the discussion, I feel like, has really been elevated, and here's what we really would like feedback on. Now they're going to get other feedback too, but at least they're understanding I think the power of the design review. And the person presenting or initiating the discussion is now typically a more junior person on the design team, or it's a group. There's 3 or 4 people of the design team that are presenting the intro, rather than what it would traditionally be, which would be the design principal or design director who's presenting that. So definitely seeing that change. I think I have to say this workshop, it was, we did 2 workshops with Designing in Color, and they did something very similar to this. Christopher Locke and his team did something very similar with their second workshop with us, and I think that sort of got the wheels moving. And so then when it was suggested, people were like, oh yeah, that's right. It was a different purpose and a different venue, but it was, we had already experienced it as a whole firm, because that was a mandatory firm-wide workshop.
What I liked about the solution was it was not, you can't call that solution just a black or brown solution. It addressed something much more globally than that, which was the idea or the observation that people weren't safe enough to feel that they could exchange their ideas. So the solution impacts everyone and creates better design. And I really, really love that idea.
That isn't that the point?
That's the
of
point.
What we're really talking about here is making it a better world, and I think that's kind of why we have to keep telling these stories. It's like, hey, this started from the position of a JEDI initiative, but everybody has benefited from this, and I think that's those are the stories we need to make sure that we do share and tell.
As a firm leader, it's one thing to address JEDI in practice. It's quite another to confront it in an industry, particularly in the private sector. Take development, for instance. Real estate development in Southern California is still largely controlled by white men.
Mm-hmm.
How do you continue to see this disparity continuing to impact communities of color? You know, being led by historically a homogenous group of people. And I hate to say it that way. Or do you think it's beginning to shift?
It's a so first of all, my sort of eye-opening to this came, and it's fun, and this comes back to what we talked about with white privilege. Part of white privilege is just being able to walk through life and not notice a whole bunch of things, right? It's one of those things I didn't really notice until I started to recruit for a higher level position and for working with development. You know, our development, our that side of our practice, it continues to grow, and we're excited that it continues to grow. So then, you know, you're recruiting. And I will tell you, all of the architects, all of the recruits, all the designers, and I mean, this is a national search, no people of color, and 2 women, and I'm talking about a roster of like 50 candidates. And I said something to our recruiter, and she says, yes, well, think about who your client is. And I thought, well, I just had never really thought about it.
Yeah.
So then I looked at our firm, which we are, I would consider a diverse firm. We're 53% non-white or diverse, and but the people working on, I will say, our more diverse staff are working on the more public sector work. And I didn't realize that we may not have an unconscious bias during hiring, or we try very hard not to.
Right.
But certainly with staffing the projects, we have. And that was a big aha. So it's a little different than your question.
No,
but I just thought I would share how
brings the point across. Yeah.
how that trickles into a studio, you know, and the way a studio is set up and staffed, and how your teams, because we typically, I think unconsciously, mirror our clients. And so, conscious or unconscious, I mean,
Right.
I'm looking at this, and you can't look at it and go, the data set is wrong. I mean,
Right.
it's right there in front of you.
And you know, that's what we're striving to do, mirror our clients. And so depending on who you are, you may very well be mirroring your client if you're a not very diverse firm. So we should be careful how we use that. But
Yeah.
I do think that it's going to come to a point where we will be challenging our clients, because at some point, if not already, it's going to challenge our values.
I think it's a really good point, and I think our goal then is to continue to put great people, and of whatever race, whatever ethnicity, whatever gender, continue to put great people, match them up with the right projects, the right project opportunities for them. Because I think if you follow that thread through, then it means that there aren't the same opportunities for everybody in the studio, right? So we have to really work to make sure that we are creating diverse teams to create opportunities. So by doing that, then I think it is one of those things that little by little we will chip away at. As it relates to the impacting communities, I mean, I really think this is another place where I think our government can help nudge in the right direction. And I think opportunity zones were created under the last administration. They really weren't necessarily designed and targeted to help people of color. The opportunity zones may have happened to have been in some areas where there are people of color, but they weren't designed with improvement or transformation of communities. And I think there's an
I think
opportunity.
the lens was purely economic.
Absolutely
I think it was just purely economically driven. It wasn't
And I
anything
think
else.
now it is considering and acknowledging
Yeah.
the much needed investment in communities of
Yeah.
color based on what we've seen this last year, right?
Absolutely. Because look, real estate development is high risk, high reward. And the people doing it, you know, and whether they're white or not, are have investors, and they are focused on
Their return.
that return. And so they're risk adverse. So it's a high risk, but it's also, to be successful, you're trying to minimize that risk all the time. So I think that's where tax credits, tax incentives, things that would encourage a developer to take a little more risk in return for a little higher.
Change the incentives.
Exactly. So we can change that formula a little bit. I think the natural opportunist quality, because developers can be really creative and they're opportunists.
Yeah.
But if you change that formula, I guarantee you're going to have
Change the incentives.
I think you could change where the development is taking place. So I do think this is one of those areas where some outside engineering would help the development community.
So the lens of disparity is kind of ever present, and that's particularly true in development or in the private sector versus public sector. And not every client recognizes that race and racism continue to exist. That's probably first and foremost. And some still choose just not to address it. It's like, it's over there, it's not my problem, it's somebody else's problem. Do you see the profession having, or how do you see the profession having that impact that we're all talking about, to really be able to see that kind of transformation?
Well, I haven't given up on architects being good role models and actually living and being a living example of a creative and democratic and our job is to make the world better. Architects, engineers, and contractors. Sort of working together to improve the world we're in. And I think in that spirit, if we can be a working example of a successful practice, a successful industry, I think it's a lead by example opportunity. That's my sense. I also see more architects getting involved in development, more contractors getting involved in development, more engineers getting involved in development. And I think so to some degree, there may be a little bit of taking matters into our own hands or showing what can be done. So I'm hopeful of that opportunity.
So by virtue of other people taking a role in development that are not necessarily traditionally developers, that change in and of itself might actually affect or swing the pendulum, is what you're saying.
Blur the lines.
Blur the line, yeah.
The lines. Speaking of blurring. So when you visited us last year, you asked us a question.
Oh, yeah.
And it was, how do we begin to create cultures that embrace a just and equitable construct? I think you have figured it out. I can't remember what we said to you last year when we answered it.
It was good. It was helpful.
You clearly came up with a path of your own. So what's your question for us this year?
My question, and I think it's something that I will immediately take back to my practice, is how do we keep the movers moving forward? How do we transition from a sprint, that sort of energy that you have with that we all had a year ago, or for those of us who picked up the torch, how do we keep that moving forward? How do we transition from a sprint to a marathon? Might
Or
be
from
another
a
way.
moment to a movement.
A moment to a movement. Yeah, much better said. Yeah.
You want to go first? I think you should go first.
Yes. I think that we need to be louder. We need to challenge each other. We need to hold each other accountable. We need to redefine what the measure of success in our field is. And I mean that from something as simple as design awards. Is there a JEDI component to that? Is there a cultural competence to that? So until we can change and challenge the status quo at you said it earlier, every step of the practice, that's what's going to make this a movement and not a moment. I also think, I honestly believe that communities are finding their voice, and they have an opportunity to hire and engage architects, engineers, and contractors, and they now know they have a voice to pick one or suggest one that they feel comfortable with. So until we can become completely culturally competent, if not representative of our communities, and I think there's a big push towards that. So I think those things, it's going to happen. Do we want to be on the right side of that or the wrong side of that? It may be a slow crawl in some cities. I do think in LA it's not going to be a slow crawl.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but every single client we have, every opportunity wants to know what's our philosophy around equity.
That's great.
And they're asking the question. Like, you have to
yeah.
really, it's not perfunctory. You have to really sit and actually be very thoughtful about it. I think to make sure that it's truly a movement, you've already taken some of those major steps. You became highly self-aware and got out of your way. And there are a number of people that I know personally that would benefit from knowing and understanding that that's a huge step in the right direction. I think the other is recognizing this is a culture shift. And Gabrielle and I talked about this a lot. The culture of your firm or any other firm has been whatever that culture has been for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. It's not going to be that you turn the light switch on and say, today, this is it. It's going to be a constant reinforcement of shifts in behavior that recognizes and appreciates other perspectives, and a marginalization of actions and behaviors that don't support that. That's the other part. Not to shame people or guilt people, but to say, you know what, that's really not the behavior that we want to reward or foster. This is the behavior that we really want to truly model and foster. And I think that's the difference between what makes it
A moment.
a moment.
Yeah, but it's really going to take concerted efforts, like your firm, like other firms who are really embracing this transformation to make it stick.
Yeah.
And so I say, let's keep at it and keep pushing and keep holding each other accountable and keep having these conversations.
And being transparent about it. The one thing that I think has been amazing about this dialogue, you've been incredibly transparent. And I think that transparency, that authenticity, leads people to understand, okay, if I can be that transparent and that vulnerable, because that's really what it is, I can really see change.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have, in the recruitment, and we haven't done a lot of hiring because we haven't, it's been a tough, it's
Tough year.
This pandemic is tough, but we have done some, and it's really interesting. It's a higher level of diversity, and that's taken a little bit more work because you do have to look a little harder. It's just based on the numbers of resumes that you get of people of color. So you have to. It's a little bit harder work, but it's not it's just a little harder, right? Just a little harder.
And it's not even harder, it's intentional.
It's intentional.
It's intentional.
So I think that's the
Different.
The other interesting thing is then the feedback with people being attracted to our practice because they could see that it is diverse, or they heard about the culture, or they in doing their own research. They chose us because of that. And I'd say that's probably warmed my heart the most, is to know that somebody chose to come work for us because of what we represent and what they thought they would find when they joined us. And then what's great about that, expectations shape culture. And so that expectation then, you know, it's the more you hire people that come in with that expectation, the more you have to live up to that expectation. So that's a good thing. You know,
Well, you get the
good for
final
us.
word.
Well, I wanted to say, you know, and it relates to what we're talking about here about moving from, you know, a moment to a movement, is that, you know, tragedies shake us, and they shake us out of our normal day, right? And so George Floyd's murder was a tragedy that affected a nation, affected a world, because of. So why? Because there was so much pent up pain and suffering that it was a dam that broke, right? And so that swelling to create a movement is something that I keep coming back to, that as humans, without tragedy, we don't get out of our little daily routine and our little daily life. And so let's, as a human race, figure out how to move ourselves forward without tragedy. I mean, it's going to sound funny when I say it, but it's tragic that we need tragedies to move us. So I think that's that just keeps coming back to me, is that we need to be better than that. We can't get so caught in our little daily routines that we forget what's important. And I think that's probably the other change that just keeps me focused. I would say focused is that we don't need tragedy to be our better selves and move ourselves in the right direction. It needs to come from somewhere else. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I
Thanks
thank
for having me.
from the bottom of my heart for coming and sitting and having this conversation.
No, I love that you invited me back.
Thank you very much to our founding partner, IBI Group, our host partner, DLR Group, to Steinberg Hart, one of our many partners on this journey, as well as SOM and co-architects. Thank you so very much for investing your time, energy, and effort in this conversation, and we invite you back to join the conversation.
And I want to thank our subscribers, our followers, our component partners, and it's not too late to join us. You can subscribe on YouTube, follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram.
You made it. Thank you.
Join us next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.